Welcome everyone to the 2025 Caring Cross Guest Speaker Series. For those of you that have been following along for the last year or so, you know me, I'm Kevin Curran. I've been teaching the Technology Education Series. I'll also be hosting guest speakers throughout the year. We're following with the original intent, which is to bring diverse experts from across the field of cell and gene therapy that are specifically curious and exploring new ways to bring access to these advanced therapies. So we've got a great lineup this year. And our friend Manar Zaghlula from the IGI, the Innovative Genomics Institute over in the Bay Area, has agreed to be our first speaker for the year. So we're thrilled to have Manar. Before I turn it over to Manar, I want to encourage everyone to chime in with questions. You can enter a question into the chat, and we'll get a conversation going after Manar's talk. I became aware of Manar when I started reading some of the IGI papers. I found them incredibly helpful for me. The IGI is involved across genome engineering, but Manar is really specifically contributing in terms of patient access to genetic medicine. There's one paper in particular that was really informative for me. It's called, the title is A Roadmap for Affordable Genetic Medicine. That was published last year. Manar was one of the authors. And if you want to build a mental framework in your own mind for how to think about the challenge here and new policies, I'm going to point you to that. Manar, with that, please share your screen and take it away.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Really appreciate the introduction, and it's great to be here at this Caring Cross guest seminar series. I have been a fan of Caring Cross for a really long time. I think what the nonprofit does and the entire community is really incredible and incredibly important. And so it's an honor and a privilege to be here and to speak to all of you. I hope that I'm a little bit under the weather, so my voice might cut out and I might have to drink some tea, but I'll do my best to get through the hour and get to some of the questions without losing it altogether. But really, what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about policy and business innovation for expanding access to genetic medicines, because this is a very new modality, cell and gene therapies, and we're learning about all of the challenges. I think the IGI and others are really thinking very carefully about, what business changes do we need, what policy changes do we need, where do we have to innovate across the ecosystem. But before I get into that, I wanted to briefly introduce the IGI. So the Innovative Genomics Institute, or IGI, is a academic research partnership between UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco. And we were founded by Nobel laureate Jennifer Doudna, who was the co-discoverer of CRISPR back in 2015. It's actually our 10-year anniversary this year. And Jennifer really envisions a world in which genome engineering innovations benefit humanity and are accessible to all. And that's really where across the Institute, we are driven by that mission to seeing this revolutionary tool to become affordable and accessible, both in human health, but also in climate and agriculture. And across our research portfolio, we have what we call the Public Impact Group, or Public Impact Team. And our role is really to align genome editing with societal needs and values. And I think that's something that's quite unique about the IGI and the academic space. Typically, academics will do a lot of research, but won't focus so much on the sort of external stakeholder engagement. And that's really, our bread and butter. Most of us on the team are science policy professionals, so we have backgrounds either in science or public policy or both. And we seek to align IGI's research innovations with societal needs and values by developing policy and regulatory recommendations that can guide responsible governance of genomic technologies, by translating some of our findings through meaningful conversations with a diverse array of stakeholder communities, whether that be in the US domestically or globally. We also provide a lot of educational resources. So I encourage you to check out CRISPRpedia, which is hosted on our website and was developed by many generations of IGIers at this point. We actually just, our communications team and really led by Hope Henderson, just published a CRISPRpedia for ethics. So if you had questions about the ethical implications of CRISPR, that's a wonderful resource to go to. And then we really want to focus, in now and in the future on ensuring that deployment is fair and equitable globally, and that everybody can benefit from affordable and accessible genomic therapies, but also agricultural product, which is a big chunk of what IGI works on, and tools. All right. So having introduced IGI, I'm going to focus more on the health policy side. So I'm the health policy manager, and my background's in rare disease. So I'm a trained scientist in genetics, and I have a background in health policy too. So that's really what I'm going to focus on, not so much the ag work, but I encourage you to check out our website because there's tons of resources there if you're interested in what IGI is doing beyond genomic therapies. And so for today, I really want to introduce some of the R&D ecosystem challenges for genetic medicines, and then move into why it is that we need a new framework, and what the IGI has done in terms of developing that framework, very much related to the paper that Kevin just mentioned. And then I want to dive into some of the policy innovation, and it's all going to be quite intertwined. A lot of the policy innovation is something that also for the Affordability Task Force had brought up or was involved in. A lot of our members are active in this area. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what other groups are doing, and then finally wrap up with sort of what the road ahead is. So to kick things off, I think a lot of folks on the call will know that cell and gene therapies or genetic medicines, I use that term quite interchangeably, they have transformative potential. We are in an era where the science allows us to do precision genome editing, or drugging the genome in a way by inserting a gene or removing the functions of a gene. And we see that outcomes can be curative. That also the space is also very conducive to what we at IGI often call platformization, or this sort of idea that you can plug and play with the different components within the cell or gene therapy, and that can make manufacturing, accelerate manufacturing and development, and can leverage some regulatory flexibilities. And then lastly, we are seeing, there's actually published literature on this, that clinical stage candidates in the genetic medicine space actually has a lower risk of failure, which is a big problem in the general drug development space. And I know, Kevin's past seminars have talked a lot about the value of death in biotech, and we're seeing that the risk is lower. And often, a lot of these clinical stage candidates, before they end up in industry hands, are de-risked by academia already in phase 1-2 clinical trials, which is a big step. But affordable access remains a significant challenge. So we are seeing multi-million-dollar price tags on these therapies, which in turn leads to restrictive coverage policies. Manufacturing is a huge hurdle. It is a very complex and cumbersome process, and regulatory standards are quite stringent, which means, manufacturing becomes more expensive because there are so many moving parts, all of which have to be at, current CGMP or current good manufacturing practice standards. And then as a result, a lot of the indications that could be drugged will not be pursued simply because of business considerations, not because the science isn't there. And I think that's what is frustrating a lot of folks in the space is the science is there, but a lot of the, you know, the peripheral sort of components to the ecosystem are the reason why we cannot have all of these medicines that technically are feasible. Going back to this idea of, you know, the price is really high. This is a list of the most expensive genetic medicines, all of which are the most expensive drugs in the history of humanity. Linmeldy, which it treats metachromatic leukodystrophy, takes the top rank at $4.25 million as list price. And I think this quote by Elizabeth Marat, who is a Kenyan journalist who recently passed away from sickle cell disease, summarizes this problem, I think, very, very eloquently. She said, the only thing more difficult than hearing that you have a disease for which there are no cures is to hear that you have a disease for which cures are available, but they are not available to you. And this is really the challenge that IGI is committed to addressing. So I think, you know, if you follow the news in this space, you'll frequently come across articles around why commercial genetic medicines are hard to access. And that can range from, you know, Medicare or Medicaid not covering things to industry simply abandoning or shelving products that are really promising or have, you know, clear safety and efficacy profiles, to, you know, companies abandoning entire continents because of business consideration. One thing, you know, if you're interested in the CRISPR space, there was a very recent Stat News special report that is right here. The CRISPR companies are not okay. It's a really, really good article that outlines why, you know, from an investor perspective, CRISPR actually did not live up to the hype, and why, you know, even though CRISPR scientifically, I think, lives up to the hype, I think there was a lot of, you know, sort of investor pitches that oversold it. And now, you know, CRISPR is really running into some of the delivery challenges or, you know, challenges with identifying large enough patient populations. Great article. So for those of you who are not as familiar with the development pipeline, I think you can think about it in 3 phases. It's really discovery and preclinical research, and then clinical trials and getting regulatory approval, and ultimately commercialization and monitoring. And that includes, you know, long-term follow-up. And, you know, across those stages, there are different players within the ecosystem. So really, you know, you have funders at the top that can be philanthropic or government, but then also venture capital is sort of the traditional way. And then you have developers or sponsors. Those could be academic institutions, could be companies, and then, you know, the sort of the interplay between IP licensing connects those two. And then you really have, you know, components like manufacturing and ultimately, well, I should say early phase manufacturing, and then late stage manufacturing, and then also the hospital that actually ends up treating the patient. And then across, you know, all of that developments, it's FDA, and specifically in the genetic medicine space, CBER, or the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. That's sort of largely the ecosystem. And I think we see challenges at every stage with every player, right? So there's only limited philanthropic and government funds that can be accessed, and that can be a challenge. Within academic institutions, it can be challenging to access supply chains, to get in line, to actually have to pay, you know, as much money for manufacturing. Or if you have an academic manufacturing facility, it's not going to be full GMP, so you're limited to, you know, how far in the you know, R&D pipeline you can actually get. Then with, you know, manufacturing, it's complex. It's an incredibly complex manufacturing process, especially if you're thinking about something like an AAV therapy or an ex vivo sort of cell therapy that needs to be processed. Clinical trials are, you know, immensely expensive, and especially in late stage, where you have to enroll more patients and have to have a commercial grade GMP product. And, you know, that's obviously tied to regulatory requirements, which can be time intensive and costly. And then on the sort of the other side, where you have venture capital, traditional venture capital expect a very high rate of return on their investment. And because they're investing in so many different companies, they're expecting that most of them will fail. They just need the one or two to actually succeed. And that's how they are going to recoup all of their investment. And so the expectations on rates of return are really high. And then, treatment and hospital costs can sometimes exceed the cost of the actual therapy, which, adds more burden to payer systems or healthcare systems, which are not designed in many cases, or I would say in all cases, to handle incredibly large one-time payments with the expectation that, healthcare savings are going to accrue over time. And that's a particular problem in the United States, where we have things like healthcare switching, insurance switching, and healthcare budgets that are really on a very short time frame and not across the population over the entire lifespan. And so just to summarize, that there's numerous challenges, some of which were on the previous slide and some of which I haven't mentioned, that all add to the affordability and access challenges, leading to high prices of the drugs and then low coverage by health systems. And so I think all of these reasons are sort of have brought about an ecosystem that is conducive to change now. I think there's a lot of government interest around the world to access transformative therapies, but at a cost-effective price tag. And that is sort of eliciting a lot of responses also from ecosystem players, like platform approvals at the regulatory stage, or regulators considering what does small batch manufacturing look like, where you maybe don't have to spend as much money or have to follow as stringent GMP requirements when it's only an ultra rare disease that only affects 50 patients. The manufacturing requirements probably don't have to be as stringent as if it is Ozempic, which everybody knows somebody who's on Ozempic. And similarly, I think a lot of innovators in the space are thinking about things like distributed manufacturing, and Caring Cross is a leader in this space, of course. And then, a lot of efforts are being made on lowering manufacturing costs and improving manufacturing technologies. And I'll briefly touch on an effort at IGI on that as well. And so I think, just to summarize before I get into the task force, genetic medicines clearly need a new business model. The for-profit venture capital framework is really built for traditional drugs or small molecule drugs, where there is a lot of risk taking and a very high failure rate. That is the justification for high cost of capital. But as I mentioned before, clinical stage CGTs are more likely to make it to approval. And so that lower risk should also be reflected in the cost of capital. The goal with traditional drugs, or the intent of a system that is built around chronic disease mitigation, is really to have sustained profits from continuous treatment. Whereas with precision genetic medicines, what we're seeing, or what we're hoping for at least, is durable effects after one-time treatment. And so that already requires a different system. And then I think what's also interesting is in terms of exclusivity, which is something that's incredibly important for businesses to protect their IP. Exclusivity periods protect chemical moieties. So like small molecules, you can protect the entire space, and then no competitor can make that same drug. But there are actually multiple paths in genetic medicines to arriving to the same genetic outcome or the same molecular outcome without targeting the same gene in the same exact way. And because you don't have that sameness in the drug, you can actually have competition even when it is a rare disease like sickle cell. And we actually saw this after Lyfgenia and Casgevy came on the market. A lot of other sickle cell programs were halted because you don't have that exclusivity, and the competition. If you're not the first one to sort of get to it, the competition is really a brick wall that you're having to go up against as a business, especially as a for-profit business in this system. And yeah, to basically all of this to say that a new business model is needed. And so what the IGI did a couple of years ago now is we put together an affordability task force where we convened 30 multidisciplinary experts and charged them to really develop a roadmap to more affordable and accessible genetic medicines outside of the traditional for-profit venture capital framework. We asked them to think about it in a way that is focused on the here and now, not speculate on, what could Congress do potentially in the future, 10 years from now, or what sort of major regulatory innovation would you need to actually implement this, but really think about, who are the players now and where could you leverage innovations in the ecosystem that we have to sort of build this new model. And so we had 4 subgroups: a subgroup on pricing and access, a subgroup on manufacturing and regulation, a subgroup on intellectual property and licensing, and then a subgroup on organization and funding models. And I'll touch on each of these a little bit, but I encourage you, if you have the time, to read the full white paper, which is online and also accessible through this QR code. It is quite lengthy, but I think it's a great resource, especially if you want to dive into one of these areas a little deeper. We also have a glossary in the end that explains a lot of the sort of basic terms. And then, as Kevin mentioned, our perspective paper in Nature that came out a couple months ago now, Roadmap for Affordable Genetic Medicines, which is really, I think, a boiled down summary of all the task force recommendations and the way ahead, sort of in a much more digestible manner. So in terms of task force recommendations, I think the 4 key areas, intellectual property, a lot of it has to do with access provisions and licensing. There's recommendations around in-country manufacturing partnerships for low and middle income countries, and that's, Caring Cross. We had both Boro and Rimas on our task force, so you can imagine where a lot of those recommendations came from. There is a lot of talk about licensing to third-party organizations, like the Medicines Patent Pool, in order to make therapies more accessible in low and middle income countries. And then you could also require further R&D as sort of a part of your licensing agreement. In terms of manufacturing regulation, again, point of care manufacturing, but also regulatory flexibility and innovation on the platform side. I think what's really interesting idea is risk-based comparability requirements for rare disorders, so that you are actually thinking about, okay, are the requirements for an ex vivo therapy the same as for an in vivo therapy, or can we put some daylight between those two and lower some of these requirements, because it's unlikely for something to be of high risk if the cell was modified ex vivo, that kind of thing. I'll dive into this, but on the pricing side, we really wanted to take a step away from value-based pricing and develop a new model that we termed dynamic cost plus, and I'll get into that. And then on the business side, we really thought a lot about what business structures could support genetic medicine from discovery all the way to the finish line across approval and long-term follow-up and monitoring, and then also what capital sources are needed to do that. So I'll dive right in. I'm seeing I'm already way behind on time, so I'm gonna move a little quickly through these slides, but I'm happy to answer questions about it later too. So I think on licensing, one key thing that has sort of come out of the task force and has been a conversation in the field for some time now is negotiating access provisions into licensing agreements. And so what that means is an access plan is when the licensee agrees to take certain steps to ensure accessibility to one or multiple populations that may not otherwise be able to access the therapy as easily. Or, I think one example of this that really stands out is Avexis. So previously, the SMA gene therapy that is now Novartis was with Avexis, and when Genethon, which was a funder of this therapy, entered into a licensing agreement with Avexis, they actually included a French patient access provision in their license that requires the licensee, Avexis or Novartis in this case, to make reasonable efforts to make available within France all of the licensed products indicated for SMA at prices that would allow appropriate reimbursement schemes. And it puts the onus on the licensee to ensure that it is, an acceptable price. And that's the kind of thing that would really move the needle on in terms of licensing for increased access. And I've spoken a little bit about these, and I encourage you to look at the paper. But I think what's really encouraging is that NIH last spring put out a draft policy that they've now finalized, specifically on requiring access provisions for wholly NIH-owned IP. And that's going to really move the needle. I think if there's strong enforcement of this, and if industry feels that the terms that are being negotiated are fair, then that can really improve access across the board for medicines that all of us taxpayers have already paid for, and we're only paying for again when we actually try and access it, and we're also paying for them through cover it or paying our health insurance premiums and into Social Security. Moving on to manufacturing, I think this idea of platform technologies is really key, and that's something that FDA is really behind. This is actually a modified slide from something that Peter Marks, the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research, has presented before, where it's really this idea of having a parent product that is approved, and then you have offshoot products where you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, or you have to resubmit the entire regulatory package, but you say, okay, the parent product was shown to be safe and effective. We're not changing the manufacturing a whole lot. We're just changing the gene or the mutation that the guide RNA, let's say, is targeting. And that's where you can really leverage a lot of the efficiencies from the initial approval for future development. And I will say that Congress, when it required this platform approach, which is actually part of an appropriations bill a couple of years ago, required that a BLA has to be in place for the parent product in order for the subsequent gene therapy to qualify under this program. But FDA is also leveraging its own flexibilities in assisting non-BLA stage products to leverage prior knowledge of their manufacturing. And that's really something where IGI, under the leadership of Dr. Fyodor Urnov, who's our Director of Technology and Translation, has entered into a partnership with Danaher Corporation, which is a conglomerate that owns a lot of different companies, which once you see them on the slide, I'm sure you will recognize them, but really with the idea of operationalizing CRISPR as a platform. And the issue that they're trying to tackle is that currently, if you have a rare or an NF1 patient that is in need of say a CRISPR therapy right now, the reality is that it takes about 4 years and $10 million to make that therapy for that child, even though it can be very quickly bioinformatically assessed what gene or what guide RNA you would need. You can have, if you have a mutation that you have very strong confidence is the disease-causing mutation, you could actually treat this patient within a much shorter time frame, and that's really the goal here. The goal is to move from 4 years and $10 million to 3 months and $100K by by leveraging all of the different Danaher operating companies and their capabilities to develop the guide RNA to add reasonable quality that is acceptable to the regulator, and platformizing the different guide RNA so that if you take a disease like familial HLH, which is a blood disorder that has many different mutations across the patient population, so you can quickly manufacture guide RNAs and package them into the same delivery platform and Cas9 or CRISPR platform quickly and efficiently and without having to reinvent the wheel every time. And Fyodor is a lot more eloquent on this, obviously, but really it is him generating a CRISPR cures cookbook is how he likes to put it. And I think that's really going to move the needle, especially because there's a lot of interest at FDA also to see this happen. I'm not going to belabor this point because I know this community knows a lot about distributed manufacturing models, but this is from a really great review article from Magdi El-Salat and Marcelo Maus about different types of distributed manufacturing. I think, maybe noteworthy is, the mobile manufacturing clean rooms that, could be deployed in low and middle income countries. I know that the Global Gene Therapy Initiative is really, really interested in trying this kind of model, but also point of care facilities that can be sort of stood up locally and facilitate a lot of this. I think the challenge that we see right now in the US is that the regulatory framework just isn't quite there yet. And we need, FDA is sort of an agency that is reactive, not proactive. And so you need to bring to them a pilot or a framework so that they can actually evaluate it. They can't just put out, how to do this and with every step of the way. But I do think it's encouraging that there is examples around the world that are already implementing distributed manufacturing models. And I think that some prime examples are the Made in Canada model, the CAR-T model, or public-private partnerships in Brazil. I think, shout out here to Karen Cross and Fiocruz entering to that partnership last year, which I think will really demonstrate the feasibility and also the benefits on cost and affordability and access through distributed manufacturing. I'll really briefly touch on accelerated approval. I'm not sure how familiar this group is with accelerated approval, but it's essentially a regulatory pathway that allows approval of a therapy based on a surrogate clinical endpoint rather than a full clinical endpoint. And so like a clinical endpoint typically takes a long time to validate and also to see in the patient because it has to demonstrate improvements in how a patient feels, functions, or survives, as opposed to a surrogate endpoint that can be a biomarker that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And so accelerated approval gives initial approval to a therapy based on that biomarker reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, and then requires a confirmatory trial after the fact, after the approval, to gain full FDA approval. And then, if it turns out that the biomarker was no good, or the actual endpoint was not demonstrated to be met, then FDA can withdraw a drug from the market. And Peter Marks has been really a strong advocate of leaning into accelerated approval for gene therapies because that's the way we're going to help a lot of the patients. Because if you have to validate a full clinical endpoint every time for every disease, it's just going to take forever and it costs a lot of money. All right, so moving on from manufacturing regulation, really thinking about pricing. So in the space right now, a lot of what we're seeing, or I would say everything that we're seeing, is really value-based pricing. And so value-based pricing is a pricing strategy where the cost of the drug, device, or treatment is determined not on how much it costs to produce it or what the market demand is, but what value it delivers to the patients and the healthcare system. And so a healthcare system then in turn somehow has to determine whether a price of a new drug is actually cost effective compared to existing standard of care. And that can be very challenging when the cost of the drug is, $2 million or $3 million, and you're having to do that over time. Now, a lot of healthcare systems outside of the US have something called a health technology assessment body. The US does not have something like this and is not bound by law to follow any recommendations around whether something is cost effective or not. Companies simply, set a list price and then negotiate with insurers what they actually get reimbursed. But I think it's worth, explaining what cost effectiveness means. And so it's really this idea that if you have, some change in cost and some change in effectiveness over the standard of care or a comparator, that's how you determine whether something is cost effective, as long as it is below some willingness to pay by the healthcare system. And so if you have a gene therapy that is more effective and less costly, which is unlikely, more effective and less costly than standard of care, or than simply doing nothing and just the hospital costs, then that should be favorable, and that should have a favorable cost effectiveness ratio. However, if it is more costly and less effective, you would reject that. And so, there's always this trade-off sort of area, like gray area, where you might have something that's more costly but also more effective, and then you have to decide whether you as a healthcare system want to pay that, whether and that's really, in the US, we don't struggle with that as much, in the sense of like the government that decides whether it's going to pay or not. It's really individual insurers setting policies that limit access. And that can be very, very difficult to address because there are so many payers. Just as an example, in the US, we have an independent body called the Institute for Clinical Economic Review. Again, nobody's bound by their recommendations or by their findings, but they found that Lyfgenia and Casgevy, which are these sickle cell gene therapies, would be cost effective at a range of $1.35 to $2 million. And in contrast, their list prices are at $3 and $2.2 million, just for some perspective. And then in the UK, which actually does have a health technology assessment body that dictates whether patients can access a therapy through the insurer, through the nationwide healthcare system, initially rejected Casgevy, but recently actually reached a deal with Vertex for an undisclosed discount, which is always interesting. If you look at how NICE typically gets access to their therapies, it's a lot of times undisclosed discounts, and we don't actually know how much they're paying. But it indicates that there is room to go down in price and still make money for these companies. And I think one thing I will just add on value-based pricing is, think about this: what is the value to patients' healthcare systems if the value-based price is unaffordable, right? So I'll just leave that here. So the task force then set out to develop a new model for pricing that would both improve access but also ensure sustainability of the company or of the entity that is implementing this price. And so the what we term the dynamic cost plus model really not only anchors the therapy to the cost of production, but is also sensitive to things like manufacturing cost and cost of capital and patient population size, right? So it changes with different factors. And so, we developed this model, and it's very much dynamic to the inputs that you put in these assumptions. But essentially here for a therapy that would go to 2,000 people or so in the US, you would have a price that is 10 times less than what maybe a for-profit venture capital backed company might ask for from an insurer. And it includes things like manufacturing costs per patient, but also constructing a manufacturing plant or contracting out to a CDMO. The R&D costs to recover in our model were $1 billion, which I think is a pretty solid number, given what's been published in the literature. And a lot of these assumptions are actually literature backed. But it also, I think, importantly at the bottom, includes a net profit for the company to continue development, and also to balance a lot. If the patient population is much smaller, for maybe 15 patients, they would have to, in this model, pay multi-million-dollar prices. But a company like this, if it has a diverse portfolio, could subsidize some of the ultra-rare disease indications with something that is a little bit more common, still rare, but more common, by including some profit margin. All right, and then lastly, on business models, I think we thought a lot about what type of entity could implement pricing structures like this, could deal with the regulations, could implement the right manufacturing strategies, et cetera. And we really arrived at a mixed business model that can leverage diverse sources of capital, but that also distributes responsibilities and expertise across where it sits in the ecosystem. And so It's really discovery and preclinical research housed within an academic institution or university. And then that IP is transferred over to a nonprofit entity or a medical research organization like a 501c3 MRO, which then is responsible for holding the IP, but also for conducting clinical trials and contracting out for manufacturing and that kind of thing. If there is something like a priority review voucher, it will also, at the end of the approval process, it would also go back to the MRO to continue development and reinvest. And then the MRO would either have, ideally would have a public benefit corporation, which is a form of for-profit entity that can balance both profits and some public benefit legally, as opposed to a traditional C-type corporation, which actually can be legally liable if they don't maximize shareholder profit. The PBC does not have to only go by shareholder profit maximization. And so the idea is that the PBC would oversee manufacturing for commercial level, and then distribution and long-term follow-up. And I think just to mention that across, actually I have it on the slide. So across the different steps, you would access different types of capital. So maybe in the academic space, you go for no-cost capital like government grants and philanthropy. But maybe on the PBC side, you could access some venture capital, but also social impact investments that maybe come with lower rates of return, but not rates of return of 0, like a government grant. And so the idea is really to diversify the financing, but also to have really strong governance structures between these that can enable market access to genetic therapies in an affordable and accessible way. All right. I am going to skip the slide, but just to say that these new business models also need new laws, and that's something that Congress is working on. And this is really just an illustration of what this would look like in the implementation. IGI is really at the first pit stop here, where we have this roadmap. But we're working right now on identifying a cell and gene therapy candidate for demonstration of this model, because we really want to see, is this, we want to demonstrate, I truly believe that this is feasible, but it has to be demonstrated in the real world. And so, all of these steps have to happen. But I think what's encouraging is that there's already mission-driven organizations that are trying these approaches in the real world. And so Caring Cross and GGTI are great examples of this. I think Rarity Inc. is something, if you're not familiar with them, something to look out for. The ADA SCID story could be a seminar of its own here. This is a curative therapy that was abandoned by for-profit, and that now the inventors of this spun out a public benefit corporation to commercialize it, get it across the finish line. There's also something called the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator, which is a nonprofit that seeks to revitalize previously shelved clinical stage medicines for ultra-rare diseases. Another story that you may have heard of is Alpida Therapeutics, which was founded by Terry Pirovolakis, whose son was actually diagnosed with an incredibly rare disease. And he then rushed to work with, I believe it was the University of Texas, UT Southwestern, to develop a gene therapy for his boy. And they're now, trying to commercialize that gene therapy and also bring on other indications. And then there's a newer model that was proposed by Crystal Makel at Stanford and her colleagues. This idea, all of the challenges that we talked about for gene therapies are all the same for pediatric cancer therapies, because industry is also does not see the business value in curing kids from cancer, apparently, with genetic medicines. And so, her proposal is a pediatric advanced medicines biotech. which would have the exclusive license from the academic institution and then license out the adult indication from that to biopharma, which would generate revenues back to the PAMB to then develop the therapy specifically for the pediatric indication and make it affordable and accessible to pediatrics. I also, that Nature Medicine article has a lot of different variations on this model that I have on the slide. I also encourage you to read that paper. All right. I will rush through outcomes-based arrangements so we have some time for questions, but I'm almost at the end of the talk. So I think lastly, at the end of all of it, once you have, researched and developed and gotten approval for a therapy, a major problem in access is getting reimbursement from the insurer. And that's particularly challenging for Medicaid, which is the government-backed insurance that is state by state. So every state has a Medicaid program, not to be confused by Medicare, which is sort of the senior government insurance for seniors that is administered at the federal level. And so, Medicaid faces challenges like state budgets that are limited and must be balanced every year. There are high upfront costs, but healthcare savings are spread over time. And that's not something that Medicaid is necessarily built to. There's a lot of uncertainty still about long-term durability of these therapies and how real those healthcare savings are going to be. And then there's, of course, state-to-state variations, both in funding and how much tax dollars each state has, revenue each state has, but also what the needs are. Like patient populations can vary quite a bit. And we're seeing this play out dramatically with sickle cell disease, where a lot of the southern states, which also happen to be a lot less revenue generating, have a much greater patient population. And so here comes this idea of an outcomes-based arrangement, which is, this idea that there is risk sharing between the company, the manufacturer, the drug manufacturer, and the insurer, by saying that, the drug manufacturer essentially says, all right, insurer, you pay us what we ask of you for this therapy. And if it does not work, or if it only works in limited capacity, then we will provide a refund or a rebate based on how well this did or did not work. So if it doesn't work at all, then you get all of your money back. If it works a little bit, then you get a little bit of a rebate. But there are a lot of challenges in implementing and negotiating these outcomes-based arrangements. Like each state would have to figure out, what is a meaningful outcome. It also means that each patient has to be followed. And that can be incredibly burdensome from an administrative perspective. And then there's also treatment costs beyond just the therapy. And then, it really doesn't get at the root cause of the problem, which is the high prices. But it is one way forward. And it's something that the Center for Medicare, CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, within their department, they have an innovation center, which is called CMMI, and the Innovation Center is trialing this access model, which is a centralized outcomes-based arrangement, essentially. And so the federal government commits resources to negotiate one agreement and all of the terms of that agreement. And so then every state Medicaid program that chooses to participate in the program is going to get one contract, but also has to agree to certain standard access policies. So like if a patient comes, the state Medicaid program that entered into this agreement can't just deny access because of some arbitrary finding. They have to abide by the agreement. And I think it's interesting. This is I didn't mention it, but this is specific to the sickle cell, Lyfgenia and Casgevy products in the pilot phase. And so, manufacturers are required in this pilot to cover fertility preservation and ancillary services, which can be quite costly on Medicaid. And so CMS would support implementation and conduct data collection, which can be quite burdensome, and then can also provide additional milestone funding. And I think this model is really something that is going to give us incredibly important learnings for the future on whether outcomes-based arrangements are a good way forward, and whether the federal government should be more involved in actually solving or more involved in negotiating and implementing these, because of just how disparate the resources are across state Medicaid programs. All right. Just to summarize, we need system-wide interventions to tackle affordability and access challenges. Our task force developed a roadmap for how mission-driven organizations may bring us cell and gene therapy from discovery all the way to market approval. And there's a lot of policy innovation in the space to try and facilitate development, but also improve access at the back end. And I will end with that, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manar. That was comprehensive. And this was the perfect kickoff to the year. Where the speakers we'll have throughout the year that we'll kind of pick up and do deeper dives on each of these areas. You've laid out the challenge and possible solutions. I see we've got some questions. I have a question I want to ask up front, but I encourage everyone jump into the Q&A if you have a question for Manar. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just keep it to a couple here. You talked about accelerated approval and how there's this enthusiasm with definitely Peter Marks and the FDA to utilize that. Is there, if a company, while the company's in that interim period where they have AA approval, but they haven't completed the confirmatory trial, is there any interest in assigning a reduced price where there's an interim price that's not exactly what the company wants, but it's something that makes sense for healthcare budgets, and then they get to pivot to their full list price once they get full approval?
That's interesting. I definitely haven't heard any industry player raise this prospect. I think that the real challenge in doing so is, the idea behind accelerated approval is that it is no different from a full approval in the sense that, in the legal sense, right? Like something that was approved through accelerated approval still has to technically be covered by insurers, because every FDA approved drug has to be covered by certain insurers if they meet certain qualifications. And so if industry started to sort of chip away on its own from the concept that an accelerated approval is no different from a full approval by offering rebates up front, I think they would shoot themselves in the foot.
Yeah. And
they would not go for it. I would be curious to see if this is implemented, if we were willing to implement it. I just don't see willingness right now, or I don't see the benefit to industry right now in doing it.
Yeah. That makes sense.
But to be fair, I mean, something needs to change, because a lot of insurers are balking at the idea of paying multi-million-dollar price tags for gene therapies that are approved by accelerated approval. Many of them will actually carve out accelerated approval drugs from coverage.
Right. If they're not convinced that the clinical endpoints are meaningful or will ever arrive. Okay. And you're touching on, I think your whole talk really, like the ethos of it communicates something that I'm aware of, which is that there's a huge percentage of people that work in the industry in and around biotech and pharma that want to see more patient access to medicine. And we all want to get paid a decent salary, and we want to work for organizations that are making some amount of profit. But there's a lot of people that would prefer to work for organizations with maybe a reduced profit if it meant more access to the medicine that they're involved with and that they're helping develop and push through. And I think that's sort of what you're touching on with creating an MRO, creating a new business structure, it only happens if there's enough people that are willing to take some reduced perspective on what the ideal profit would be. And my experience is there's a lot of people in the industry that are like that. A lot of people are sickened by what we've seen with these outrageous pricing and reduced patient access. It's contrary to the whole reason they got involved in science and medicine to begin with. So I do think that exists.
I absolutely agree. I think the majority of folks that are working in biotech have a true passion to help patients and want to see this happen. I think the challenge is that a lot of the issues that we're seeing in access and affordability cannot be solved by a single player, and they really are pervasive and structural. And so unless we change, unless some of the main players or some of the main components change, like maybe we get more CERM type funding upfront that reduces the risk, and then later on can be taken over by biopharma at lower investor expectations.
Yeah.
Or if investors agreed that the risk was lower upfront and they would ask for a lower rate of return, which we are not going to see anytime soon. Or something innovative like payers coming in and funding some of the earlier development upfront and say, okay, well, if we pay now and we help you get this over the finish line, then you also give us a reduced rate later, and we can make this more affordable for everyone. So I think, I don't think most people are interested in not seeing access. I mean, also, biopharma wants to sell these things, right?
Yeah.
But I think the challenges are just so pervasive, and they really are, structural barriers that we have because our status quo was built for traditional small molecule drugs, which have very different challenges and very different types of administration and modalities, and they treat in a different way.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I'm going to turn it over. We've got a question here from Jose and Manar. You knew this was coming with the whole federal shakeup. So the question is, with the new environment in Washington, if you were going to put on your magical predictor hat, what do you see being hindered or possibly stimulated in terms of these approaches by the new administration?
Yeah. I'll just say I don't want to speculate. I think nobody knows, right? Like nobody knows really how the new administration feels about cell and gene therapy specifically. I think there are some indicators that we might actually see some stimulation, some positive signs. Like I think one example is in Congress, the Senate Health Committee, Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, is now chaired by Bill Cassidy, who's a medical doctor from Louisiana, who has been very, very vocal about greater access to cell and gene therapies and facilitated development of cell and gene therapies, an improved regulatory environment and greater regulatory flexibilities. So I think that's something that's very encouraging. I'm not aware of a stance that the once Senate confirmed administrator for CMS, Dr. Mehmet Oz, would take on the CMMI model for sickle cell. I don't know if that's something that he would get behind, or something that maybe isn't a priority and might get nixed. We don't really know. We also don't really know how changes in the workforce composition in DC are going to impact things like FDA. I think at FDA specifically, I've read some news that pharma is going to have a word to say if FDA sees dramatic reductions in staff, because the worst thing for pharma and investors is uncertainty. And having less staff, uncertainty and then delays in approvals. probably the second worst thing. And
Yeah.
so, if FDA staff were to be cut dramatically, especially on the reviewer side, then I think biopharma would not be a huge fan of that. And I think biopharma has a pretty good working relationship with the Trump administration, so they might have his ear or have their ears.
Yeah.
And then who else? NIH. I think NIH TBD. We don't know where the funding cuts are gonna. We don't know what the budget looks like that they're going to pass. We also don't know what indirect cost cuts are going to be actually implemented after I think a court hearing is scheduled for Monday. I could be wrong on the date, but it's in the courts, so we'll see.
Yeah.
I don't know. So a lot of it is like, I don't know. Nobody knows. And we'll just have to find out. Sorry, Jose. It's not a very satisfactory answer.
No, we're all trying to wrap our head around that and keep up with the news. So we are at the end of the hour. Manar, thank you again for joining us and kicking off the 2025 year. And I hope to stay in touch. I'm sure IGI and Caring Cross will continue to stay in touch and work together.
Yeah, and feel free, if anybody has follow-up questions, to email me. I don't know if maybe Kevin, did you have my email somewhere? Anyway, you can find me on LinkedIn or.
Yeah, we can post it. Yeah, Manar Zaghlula on LinkedIn, and check out the roadmap for affordable genetic medicine and the white paper that goes into more detail on the IGI website.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a wonderful Friday.
Yep, you too.
Take care.